teens and all of those, that's a big place for them to get things that are cheap, just stuff, but at a much reasonable price.
Good deal. Well, it looks like we can get started.
Okay.
So welcome to the third session, I guess, of our Bible study, More Than a Shepherd. Congratulations to you. You've made it through like the longest chapter in the Old Testament last week. It was a mammoth chapter, right? Like 57 verses. Today's chapter is going to be a lot shorter than that. But interestingly enough, even though it's only one chapter over, this kind of starts a new, kind of a new section, even in 1 Samuel and even in the story of David, right? So far, we've read about how David has been introduced as the shepherd who was anointed by Samuel. We've seen how he's been introduced as the musician on Saul's court, and he's been kind of introduced as a successful warrior, right, in kind of slaying David. Right now, these coming chapters, we're just going to go into chapter 18, but like 18 through 20 is more so about how did David's relationship to Saul, to Saul's family, and to the people of Israel as a whole, how did that kind of come about? And how did that evolve? So that's what we're kind of reading about today. And I think really starting really at chapter 18 is a pretty good spot to do it. Really in this chapter, we'll see the focus is really on David and David's family. No, not David and Saul, and Saul's family. And when we say Saul's family, it's really his kids, or some of them specifically, as we'll see. It's almost like there's some, we'll hear that David is kind of going out and about and fighting the Philistines again, but it's not really it's not really all that important who exactly he's fighting, where exactly he's fighting, how exactly he's fighting, how long he's been gone. It's just kind of mentioned, it's like a side comment. If this were a soap opera or something, it would almost be like Saul's court from the one camera angle, and then just kind of like you have a change of picture, like different camera angle, and it would just say 2 weeks later, and David would be back, like, hey, here I am again. That's kind of how you can imagine that to be. All right, now let's start reading this. Overall, in this chapter, in chapter 18, we can almost split it up into like 4 sub-stories. And the first part is really only the first 5 verses. So 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 5. Is someone brave enough to read it for me? We can really go around the room almost. We have 4 people here.
I can do that.
All right, thank you, Carol.
When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved.
Perfect. Wonderful. So, interestingly enough, right, I just talked about how, we kind of learn about like David's relationship to Saul and the kids and the entire people of Israel, right? And in verse 5, what happens? Everybody's a big family, right? They're all friends right now. David is popular with the people of Israel. Saul loves him. Saul's kids love him. Everyone is happy, right? Interestingly enough, though, if we go back even to the first verse, this kind of picks up right where the 17th chapter has left off. I don't know if you remember how it ended last week, but last week, really the last few verses were actually Saul kind of asking for David to come over and being like, hey, David, whose son are you? And David was like, oh, your faithful servant is the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, right? And right there is apparently where Jonathan kind of picks it up, right? In that moment, Jonathan I don't even know how to call this, but I don't want to say he falls in love, but I mean, that is one intense friendship right there, isn't it? I mean, they are very, very close together here. And I mean, clearly this is something that goes a little bit beyond, I don't know, a normal friendship and an own self-interest. So Jonathan is really concerned for David and David's person here himself, if that makes any sense. If we look in the Old Testament anywhere else, I think we find something similar to that in Genesis in chapter 44, in verses 30 and 31. That is the Joseph story. Do you remember this story of Jacob, Israel, how he had 12 kids, and Joseph was number 11, and he got sold into slavery? By his brothers, right? And so in chapter 44, we're at that point where Joseph has already worked himself up. He's really popular in Egypt. Everybody loves him. And now his brothers come over to him to buy grain from him because there's a famine in the land of Canaan. And the brothers don't recognize Joseph, right? And so they kind of ask him for grain and everything. And Joseph is playing kind of tricks on him. Because he says, oh yeah, Benjamin, the smallest one, he's got to stay with me. And then kind of Judah, one of his older brothers, kind of jumps in and he's like, oh, great Pharaoh's lord, whatever title they had, basically. He kind of just says, please don't do that, to our father, because our father loves our little, our smallest Benjamin so much. His soul is bound to, or what does it actually say? I think, my father and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, is kind of what it says. So, and if you steal our little son Benjamin, if you keep him there, our father will die. It's not even about Benjamin being harmed, but our father will just die if Benjamin doesn't come home with him, with us. That's how close they are. So it's almost like just I don't know. They're like this. They're just super close. It's so close. It's really kind of it's fascinatingly close, and really that's kind of the emotional bond right there that you get in verse 1 already. And Saul is apparently all in on it, right? He almost adopts him here in verse 2 if we kind of look further, right? Where it kind of says, Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. I mean, he didn't sign the papers yet, but apart from that, I mean, it's basically finalized, right? David kind of stays in the...
Did David have a choice?
Did David have a choice? That is a good question, right? And the text won't really tell us. It's just kind of like, that's what they did. Mm-hmm. I don't think he would have had. Back in those days when the king said, you jump. When the king says stay, you stay. That was kind of it. And then in verse 3, we even have the covenant that David made with Jonathan because he loved him as his own soul. That is also a really kind of an interesting part. If we think about it, it's almost like in verse 1, you have an emotional bond that is being formed. In verse 3, Jonathan is already ready to make this official almost. It's not a marriage or anything like that, but it's almost like a political bond that they make with one another. And when Jonathan actually even gives him his robe and gives him his armor and gives him his everything, we need to understand Jonathan was the son of the king. He was Prince Jonathan, right? So when he kind of handed over his robe and everything, that was almost like symbolically handing David over the kingdom, or the throne succession here. That's really what this is kind of symbolically saying too. So just in case the anointing by Samuel and being in Saul's court and killing Goliath and getting all the privileges around with that wasn't just enough yet to get David onto the throne of Judah and Israel, this kind of does the trick once again, if that makes sense. Are there any more questions about these first few verses that you have? Anything that seemed odd? Yes, sir.
Well, we haven't got to it yet.
Okay.
It's talking about tambourines and musical instruments. I thought that was kind of shady.
Oh.
In some religions.
Oh, okay. It could be. I think. We'll get there in a minute. Yeah. But I think back then it was kind of just like a regular instrument, that people would use to just celebrate when they were happy. But yes, we're about to get there. Can somebody read for me verses 6 through 16?
Okay, I can do that.
Thank you.
6. Where am
I don't.
Okay.
Different Bible.
Oh.
Yeah, I do have a different one. Okay. Women came out from all the towns along the way to celebrate and to cheer for King Saul, and were singing and dancing for joy with tambourines and cymbals. However, this was their song: Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Of course, Saul was very angry. What's this, he said to himself. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. How much further?
A little further.
Okay.
16.
Yep.
So from that time on, King Saul kept a jealous watch on David. The very next day, in fact, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave like a madman. David began to soothe him by playing the harp, as he did whenever this happened. But Saul, who was fiddling with his spear, suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David jumped aside and escaped. This happened another time too, for Saul was afraid of him and jealous because the Lord had left and was now because the Lord had left him and was now with David. Finally, Saul banned him from his presence and demoted him to the rank of captain. But the controversy put David more than ever in the public eye. David continued to succeed in everything he undertook, for the Lord was with him. When King Saul saw this, he became even more afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved him, for he was as one of them.
All right. All right. Are there any questions you have about this part of the text? Or any remarks?
Why did he put an evil spirit on him?
Why did he put an evil spirit on him? Good question. Let's see.
Nobody knows. An evil spirit from God
Yes.
rushed upon Saul.
Yes. That is true. I think we've talked about this, I think, even in a past session before. I feel like we've talked about it. It is disturbing, right? That image of like evil coming from God. But we need to understand, back in that world in which David and Saul and all of them lived back then, everything ultimately came from God. So it's kind of an interesting interplay between it was God's will and it's your fault. That is always at play here in the back of this story. On the one hand, yes, it wasn't against God's will that this happened, but on the other hand, you also did something usually to make this happen and to bring this upon yourself.
He was jealous, yeah. So,
Right? He was jealous. That probably was one part. Absolutely. And as we know, even from the last two chapters, Saul was Saul was always kind of the character who acted in unking-like ways almost, right? I mean, in chapter 16, maybe not so much, right? He was just kind of like, he had that evil spirit and it was rough. But even last week when we think about it, Saul was always the kind of guy who was always kind of childish, right? Just if we think about it, back when Saul was anointed king, he was really specifically also anointed, not only to be king, but also to fight the Philistines. And that went well for a while. But last week, right, he was just kind of just standing there like, oh yeah, this Goliath guy, we can't really do anything about him. So he was afraid along with all his men until David came along and kind of, solved that problem. But it was always kind of Saul who didn't act necessarily very king-like anymore, even in the last chapter.
Okay, when she was asking about that, like up here where it says that King Saul now kept David in Jerusalem and wouldn't let him return home anymore, would that have been part of why God was angry? Because he was kind of almost keeping him prisoner, according to the way that reads.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Because the head of that, it talks about how families got to know each other. But it doesn't sound like they particularly did, and his father really, it never says that his father had okayed that. That's true.
That's true. That's actually a great observation. I am not sure. That might have belonged to it. I haven't read necessarily anything about, what was customary and what wasn't, but it might as well be. It might as well be. Yeah. I think, what I realized, especially to Scott now, so I guess what kind of happened is, right, in between verses 5 and 6, right, one of those 2 weeks later kind of episodes happened. So David must have gone out to kill a Philistine soldier. Probably wasn't Goliath, because something has happened here in the meantime. It doesn't necessarily just like connect from chapter 17 right to chapter 18 verse 6.
2 weeks later.
Exactly, right? It was probably maybe a week later or so, or months later, that David even moved out again. And then 2 weeks later, he came back, right, and killed some other Philistine. And who it was doesn't matter. And how he did it doesn't matter. And where it was doesn't matter. All that matters is David kind of, he was successful. He won the day. That's all that matters here. And what this chapter kind of keeps our focus on is, how does David, how does that jive with Saul? How does that jive with the people of Israel? And Saul is getting jealous, right? And the reason why is, if we think about this, I mean, the picture that we get here is, if you look, for example, even at Exodus chapter 15, that's right the point in the Bible when the Israelites have just crossed the Red Sea and all the Egyptians got buried by the waves. This is an entire party chapter. I mean, just exaggerate. I'm speaking exaggeratively, but that's where they all celebrate, because that's where like Moses kind of sings this big old song, and all the women break out their tambourines again, and they celebrate and they dance and they sing, and they are joyful for what God has done and for the glory that God has done. This is kind of the same picture, right? All the women come out and like, yes, David, you did it. You did it. This is awesome. And what they do here really is, the rhyme that we have here, that we see here, I think it was 1,000 that Saul killed and 10,000 that David killed. This was like a traditional, like, 2-line little poem. This was maybe your something borrowed, something blue, something old, and something new. Like, everyone kind of knew that rhyme, or the ring around Rosie, something along those lines. I couldn't come up with a better example, but it was just a very popular kind of like 2-line kind of poem that they used. And what they did here is, usually that poem would have the same subject in the first and the second line. So the traditional case would have been probably like, oh, Saul killed 1,000 and 10,000 more, or something like that. But now they go, oh, Saul killed 1,000, but David killed 10,000. That was kind of insulting. And the women must have known that too. So it kind of had a little bit of a bad taste, and it would have left a bad taste in anyone's mouth, including and especially Saul's here, right? And this is really kind of the kicker, right? This instance where Saul is starting to get jealous, or Saul is kind of, he's giving David the stink eye from here on out, right? Suspicious, evil, jealous. Like that's kind of what's going on. And from here on, this relationship turns very sour very quickly, as we see. Saul is being very angry, obviously. And whether he knows it or not, he is really kind of prophesying what's going to happen, right? When he says like, oh, what's next for this guy? He's been so successful as a warrior. All that's next for him is to be king, and that's exactly kind of what's going to happen, right? And if we think about it too, especially with the very angry, right? As we might know, anger is usually a secondary emotion. Like, you don't just, anger is always your reaction. Like, it kind of always goes hand in hand with other emotions too. And usually it's either you're being sad about something that really kind of hurts you, or you're really being afraid of something. And right here, Saul is obviously very afraid he's going to lose his kingdom, and that he's going to kind of lose everything he has.
But if you have anger and you don't use it to serve God, then it is a sinful form of anger.
Yes.
Right. And that's absolutely true, right? At this point, Saul has multiple choices, right? He can kind of, he chooses the low route, right? He chooses the bad route of like, oh, I'm going to go against David. This is terrible. He kind of chooses the route that really will lead him down to evil and very bad parts. He could have also just said, hey, this is the guy I put into as captain of our army. He could have just kind of said, hey, this was also my choice, and I'm glad, he elevates us, and just kind of rolled it out. Or he could have just, conceded that, hey, you know what, this guy got something done that I couldn't do, and that is awesome, and just kind of left it there. But he doesn't. So you're right. It's, at this point, Saul had options. He had options to, react to it differently, and just, or just caught himself and been like, you know what, I'm really angry because I'm really afraid, and here are my issues, Lord. But I realized, at the end of the day, not my will but yours be done. So I'm going to go with what you got. And that takes a lot of power, or I mean, it takes a lot of greatness from anyone. Usually, if we think about the history of kings or any kind of leaders, even if they were elected, right, they usually kind of go more down the road of Saul more often, tend to do that more often than they just say, you know what, this guy is better than me, it's okay, I'm just going to step off, right? There's something about power, there's something about being a king that kind of makes you want to not give that up anymore.
Also, I'm uncomfortable with celebrating killing. In a time of war, that's understandable. But
True.
this sounds like a time of peace when they're celebrating in the streets.
Okay.
So it's worshiping war almost in a way. Saul is.
Well, you know what, Scott? I think in that time, and I've talked about
That's
this. I
Old
think
Testament,
in the
rather New Testament.
it was really a time when even though Israel and Judah kind of moved into the Promised Land, and they had their land of milk and honey, they were surrounded by enemies. There were bunches of tribes that were, and it was never like all-out war. It was never like either we're all going to go to hell, or going down, or you will. Doesn't matter. No, it was always kind of like, let's attack those guys today. Skirmishes. Thank you. Yeah, just kind of like, we don't like each other, and that's okay, and we respect that, and we don't kind of clash with each other every time, but every now and again there was a skirmish. From different sides, there were just different tribes that were kind of coming, trying to take stuff away. During David's and Saul's time, the Philistines were the main aggressor, apparently, or the main problem. And so, what they're, I guess, celebrating is just the fact that either they defended a skirmish, or maybe they even did an exploit themselves and kind of moved over there. So it was a weird situation. And whatever happened, whatever the war situation was, whether they probably them defending the skirmish, it also always meant kind of my God against your God. Let's see who's stronger here today. And so every time you won on the battlefield, it was also a victory of your God. It was a religious experience. It was a reason to praise God. And that is very foreign for us today, right? Because we're just like, hey, you shall not kill. War is not a good thing to do, right?
For the past few decades, we've lived in relative peace.
In relative peace, that's true. Yeah, that is right. Let's hope it'll stay that way for a lot longer.
At least in this region, there's other parts of the world that...
Always, right? Always. I think it was years ago when I just heard there's like 75 wars going on right now. I mean, that was then, and you just kind of go, wow. There's only like 400 countries. I think there's 300-something countries in the world. If you have 75 wars going on, then how many of them are at peace? That's a lot. That's true, and we've lived in relative peace. Thanks be to God for that. Yes. That's true. Back then, and really until probably a couple of centuries ago, people usually didn't have that luxury. War was kind of always a reality that was going on off and on.
Well, Saul should have been considering David a blessing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Rather than competition.
I think so.
But he was so jealous of his popularity.
I think so. Yep.
And he thought of him as a threat to his throne.
Yep.
The threat to his.
That is true.
That the people would like him more and make him king.
Yep.
Because it wasn't. I think it was hereditary back then sometimes, but they could always get somebody new in there. You know how that goes.
Well, yeah. I mean, and clearly Samuel did, right? Even in 1 Samuel 16, right? He anointed.
They picked him.
Yeah, God picked David, right? After Samuel had to anoint Saul, it was David who went. Mm-hmm. So interestingly enough, right?
Right.
What's also really a very fascinating kind of side story, right? Is Saul throwing the spear, right? He's the one who just. It almost seems like out of the blue, just kind of decides to just, crush David right there. Yeah.
Quite possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And to an extent, it's almost like he's biting into the hand that feeds him there, right? Because David played the lyre to calm him down from his evil spirits. But then I guess his anger, his fear, his jealousy just so took over that he just kind of had to, just short-circuited and just kind of tossed a spear at him.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, it's David evades him, right? Like he kind of, is able to dodge that spear twice, and then it's actually Saul who is afraid. And you know what? I think I would be too if I were in Saul's shoes in that moment. If I can't even kill him with
That's
weapons,
what
if
makes
he
him
is
even
unarmed.
angrier, probably,
Yeah,
that he doesn't want to be afraid.
yeah.
That's not what a king should be.
No, he should not be afraid, right? And now he must, for the first time in probably years, feel absolutely powerless. Because there is nothing he can do. If I can't even kill you with weapons and you're not even armed, what in the world can I do, right? Everything you touch turns to gold. Everything I seem to touch, well, I don't know. It doesn't necessarily turn to ashes yet, because Saul,
Not yet.
it's, but he's having a rough time, clearly, right? He's some kind of sick, right? He has an evil spirit. All
Even
of that is going.
Jonathan likes him more than it probably, I mean, his own son.
That relationship remains to be seen, right? And the text doesn't really even talk about that yet, right? But there must have been some rub in the royal family those days,
Yes,
right?
right.
If one is absolutely head over the heels in friendship love with David, and the other one just absolutely can't stand him anymore,
romance.
yeah, exactly. I mean, that is a conflict waiting to happen, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a terrible conflict really there. Yeah. Right, and really at this point, I think Saul's decline, in whatever way, right, mentally and in power, or spiritually, actually. Let's talk spiritually, because really this is, if it says it's an evil spirit from God, maybe we, I think as 21st century human beings, a lot of us would be like, oh yeah, he was bipolar, he had depression, he had this, that, and the other. We like to do that, but maybe we should honor the text for what it says too, right? It's an evil spirit from the Lord. It's a very spiritual component here, right? And music apparently kind of soothes him. Yeah. So that's at least where we're at. But once again, if we look to verse 14, right? That's kind of the core of this chapter and of the previous chapters too, and of the theme that kind of keeps happening, right? That everything kind of moves around. It's almost like the center of gravity of this entire story so far. David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. Right? We've heard it again and again in the past 2 chapters. The Lord was with David. That's why David came to be anointed. The Lord said, I am with this one. I'm not with the firstborn son who was handsome and tall and just, just totally got Samuel when he was, when he came to anoint. No, I am with David, with the little one. Right? When he fought Goliath, hey, you might be able to trust in your own power and your own strength, but I trust in the Lord, and and I'm with God, and what are you going to do about it, right? And once again here, even in this weird struggle with Saul, God is with David, and whatever David, everything David does ends in a success somehow. Interestingly enough. And really, if we look through this chapter, I think it's already said before verse 14 as well. We can already see it in verse 12, I think. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul, right? And we'll see it again, I think, in verse 28, when even Saul recognizes, when it dawns on Saul that, oh man, the Lord is with David.
Can't he
And
be with everybody?
yeah, I know, right? Why can't the Lord be with everybody?
Yes.
Hey, and in verse 28 is going to be a lot rougher for Saul too. But maybe we can, and we'll see that in just a little bit. I think another point that I kind of wanted to point out too is another theme that's sort of happening here in these little stories again and again is David's success, right? We have it in verse 14. We've had it in verse 5 already when he went out to slay that Philistine that was not Goliath, or when he went out on his wars. David was successful, right? And the women celebrate him. David is successful here, and the Lord is with him. And later on, I think we will come across it again. I think because he's going to be fighting the Philistines again. It's going to be another one of those 2 weeks later, David came back kind of scenes, right? David was successful there as well.
Yep.
And painstakingly for Saul, once again, David is successful in doing what Saul wants to do, or what Saul was kind of called to do, what he was anointed to do, and what once upon a time he was actually good at. And that is kind of fighting the Philistines and keeping those guys at bay. And it's really interesting because as this chapter kind of unfolds, we will see that all the obstacles that Saul is trying to throw in David's way, I mean, he has set him to be the captain and just the leader of his army. That means David was front line in every battle, right? That's kind of a dangerous spot to be in when you're in a battle, right? All of that kind of flies right into Saul's face. All the obstacles that he tries to, throw into David's face, all the ways he tries to get rid of David by sending him into battle, or charging him with other tasks that he has to do, all of that only makes David more successful and more notorious with the people of Israel, basically, and with all the other folks. All of that flies right into his face. So whatever Saul means as an obstacle for David is elevating David. It really ends up doing that. And I think we will see that in the next few verses. Actually, the third episode is the shortest one. It's only 3 verses. It's verses 17 through 19. Can somebody read that for me? All right, Mary.
Then Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battle." For Saul thought, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines deal with him." David said to Saul, "Who am I and who are my kinfolk, my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But at the time when Saul's daughter Merab should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, whatever that is.
Maholathite.
Maholathite as a wife.
Thank you. Yes.
So he said one thing and did another.
And he did another, right? But once again, he said, "Hey, I will give you, I will give you, I will give you my daughter. You'll become a prince too. But first of all, you're going to have to fight some more, right?" And David does that and is successful, and the Lord is with him, right? And it just doesn't work out for Saul the way it is. And he's pulling something really shady once again, right? He's doing something that something really sinful in that sense, right? By giving the daughter that he promised to David, actually to another guy. I actually found out where that city is, the Maholathite. I think it's called Abdel Meholath, I think, and it's east of the Jordan River. If we look between basically the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, the Jordan kind of runs right in between, almost like straight. It's sort of in the northern half, so we're almost to where Jesus lived, pretty much. That's where he's from, which is a lot further up north than the Jerusalem area that actually David was in, at least up until this point. If we think about it, right, all the battles, all of that kind of happened right west of Jerusalem, just maybe 10, 20 miles west of there. That's kind of, we're operating in a very small speck of earth, planet-wise. Back then it probably was a lot bigger. They didn't have cars, they didn't have roads that were as good, and the terrain is very uneven. There's a lot of rocks, a lot of hills, a lot of mountains. At least around the area there are a lot. So it's kind of harder to cross that. But either way, that's kind of the area that they have been operating in. Interestingly enough, though, right, if we think about what Saul does to David here, right, if we think a little further, when David is king and when he has all his wives and all his children, and there's another woman that kind of catches his eye, right, called Bathsheba.
Her husband out in the front
He sends
lines.
her husband out in the front lines, right? So interestingly enough, whatever Saul does to David here, David is going to pull that same trick onto Uriah, onto Bathsheba's husband later.
I think that goes under what goes around comes around.
I guess it does. Only David is still so darn lucky, right? Because it works out for David.
He does, yeah.
Yeah, it's second try, but he does.
It's the absolute power corrupts. Is it? How's that line?
Oh, power corrupts?
Yeah. No, there's a.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what we see from David there, right?
He got corrupted just like Saul did by
Yep.
having all that power.
Yep.
It's more than one person should have
Absolutely.
most of the time.
Yep. And interestingly enough, right, this text actually is really, it's giving us a real good close-up of how Saul operates here, right? We literally get to hear his thoughts, right? "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines deal with him." Yeah, and David kind of reacts with humility, which is an interesting way to react, right? Oh, who am I? That I should be the king's son-in-law, I guess, to be, because I'm only from like a humble family in Bethlehem somewhere, which I think I told you was probably sort of considered like as backwater as they come, Very fascinating here, and I kind of want to know, and this text kind of leaves it a little bit open, but was that a coincidence that David just kind of says that, or did he have something in mind there? Was he able to kind of even look ahead, to what was going to happen? Because it seems like this was probably the wisest thing he could have said in that situation.
I don't think so much. Because when you read on, he's very young right here, really.
He should be, right? I mean, he was like...
He hasn't
6 years
married.
later.
Well, you're right. He is not married yet.
Because it talks in later about how he marries and he has more than one wife and stuff. So that's putting him growing up a lot.
Yeah.
I think he's still in innocence here, and I think he truly is,
Yeah.
just kind of amazed that he's
Okay.
giving us all this
Okay.
attention.
He's a kid.
That's a good point.
Mhm.
Okay.
We need a timeline.
No, that is true.
That's
That
not
is
gonna
true.
happen.
Yeah. And David is gonna have that many wives and yea many children. It's gonna be a long line there.
He's gonna get to a point where he gets thinking
Oh, yeah.
that way for sure. But.
Oh yeah. That is right. That is right. Are there any other questions you have about these verses? Okay, that's all, because that's all I wanted to talk about.
All I know is I see there's a lot of replica in what goes on in life today, not about out killing people, but in different ways of still maneuvering. To,
Yeah, manipulated.
Yeah.
Manipulation.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. And in one way or another, we probably ourselves, right, come into that way of like, hey, you know what, we can, let's deal with two problems at once and let this other person take care of whatever is there and let them get burned. And then we jump in and do whatever, or not. Yeah. So you're right. Dirty delegations, right? It happens. It happens.
Sometimes we learn too much.
Yes.
Power corrupts.
Well,
Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolute.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
do I have someone to read the last 10 or 11 verses for me? That's the last part of the story, verses 20 through 30.
You want to do it?
Yeah. You read
Right here.
it.
You already have.
Okay, yeah. Now Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David's. Saul was told, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private, and say, see, the king is delighted with you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants reported these words to David in private, and David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man of no repute? The servants of Saul told him, this is what David said. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servants told David these words, David was well pleased to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David rose and went along with his men and killed 100 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become king's son-in-law. Saul gave him his daughter Michal as a wife, but when Saul realized that the Lord was with David, and Saul's daughter Michal loved him, Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy from that time forward. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his fame came very great.
Thank you.
Oh,
Wow.
Saul's not liking that.
Oh, no. Can you imagine that your greatest enemy is having great success and now he's getting to marry your daughter who loves him? Lord have mercy. But you know what? That is a very fascinating part, because this is the only verse in the Old Testament where we actually hear that a woman has feelings for a man, or actually kind of loves a man. We need to remember.
They get to marry the guy.
And they get to marry, right? Especially in Old Testament times, right? Marriages were still arranged. It wasn't a love marriage. That's a more modern concept of how we get to pick our spouse who we love so dearly. That is a modern concept. Back then it was about power, honestly. It was about, the interest of the families, right? And conserving those. And usually the woman had zero say in it, as much as I hate to say it, but it's true. That's kind of how it was. So Michelle or Michael, or however you want to name her, or however her name might be pronounced, right? It's when she kind of puts it out there and is like, oh, I love David. That was a bold move in David's time and Michael's time, apparently. So kudos to her for that. And interestingly, I'm sorry. I felt like I cut somebody off.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, either way, interestingly enough, right now Saul is trying the same strategy again, right?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. That's what that I'm so poor and I'm so humble and I don't deserve to be the king's daughter, son-in-law.
Yep, exactly, right? That's what David does again. And interestingly enough, right, Saul tries the same tactics again. He's like, oh, well, you get to marry my daughter again if you do this and that. And this time, he's a little smarter, right? This time, he kind of uses one of his servants to bring the news. So, I'm sure David kind of by now figured out that their relationship is not exactly great. And so he probably is smart and wise in using kind of Saul's daughter, his servant, right, to bring the news to David and talk to David there. And obviously, that still doesn't work out, right? Once again, David is successful and the Lord is with him, and whatever kind of Saul wanted, David gave him. It's actually really, now that I'm saying that, he should have just said whatever he wanted to get done as a king, right? Hey, why don't you go conquer all the Philistines? He probably could have gotten that out of David in that situation if the Lord was with him that much, right? But I wanted to point kind of to one more interesting part of this. If you think about it, right, we know exactly what Saul is thinking, right? We got this pointed out multiple times. He's like, oh, well, I'll let the Philistines take care of David. I'm not going to take care of that myself. We get to hear Saul's innermost thoughts. We get to see Jonathan at the very beginning of the chapter just being head over heels in friendship love, or whatever it is, right, with David. We get to see David or Michal, right, the other daughter, just kind of like fall absolutely in love with David as well. We know pretty much the emotions of everyone around the table, right? We get to see all the women of Israel being super excited and super joyful. But how does David feel about all that? Exactly, right? Crickets. It's absolute crickets. We don't really get to hear any of it, right? David doesn't, it's really, when Jonathan loves David, it's all about Jonathan loving David, and Jonathan does the covenant. It's not like David is like, oh yeah, let's do that, that's great. That's not really there. When Michal says, hey, I love David, I want to marry David, what David says is, or what it says is, David is well pleased to become the king's son-in-law, not Michal's husband. This is not about the woman, this is about the daddy-in-law. He's like, oh yeah, royal bloodline, let's go. And even in the meantime and in the in-between time, right? Like, we don't really hear necessarily how he's even feeling about Saul at all, do we? It's all kind of left in the dark how David is feeling about this. Did you notice that too?
Okay, yeah.
It's really kind of an interesting dynamic that's going on here. And I feel like in this story, we don't hear David too much in this. You know what I mean?
I think David just does what he's expected to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess he's giving all the right answers and all the right time. He seems really slick, like, oh, me, just, I mean, he comes across as very humble, and he was probably honestly very humble in that situation. But it's really interesting to me how, we sometimes hear his answer, but it could almost be calculated too, if that makes sense. Well, hey, the king selects me, who I'm from like really working class heritage, right? To be his son-in-law, that is an honor to me, and I'm gonna respond accordingly. If that makes sense. I feel like there's a way to almost read this as a calculated response.
But he's so young, too.
He is young too. That's true. That's true.
I think I think he was just well brought up, and he's still
Okay.
young enough that he does what he's told, and
Okay.
he's very appreciative of the blessings.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he's really mature enough to understand that there's really bad people that will manipulate.
Yeah, I think he's naive about Saul.
Yeah,
You think so?
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
at least earlier part,
Mm-hmm.
where Saul was trying to set him up. And
He understands the Philistines as enemies,
Mhm,
but he
mhm.
still has trust in people who supposedly love you.
when he's offered the daughter, he's kind of, well, he's too naive to realize that that's another spear being thrown at him.
Yeah. I mean,
As a joke.
you know what? I wonder. I tell you what. I think David is. I wonder if David is kind of. If David could almost be seen as a tactical genius here, and just because he was young, he might have almost had it like intuitively knowing, what he needs to say and what he doesn't need to say.
Well, at this point, he might have been still guided by God, having
Yeah.
more of the gift.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Well,
that's the other thing, not just
that's the other
idea
thing,
that
yeah.
he's young,
That's true.
that God is directing him.
He's he's naive to going along with what's politically correct or what's
Mm-hmm.
expected. Instead, he's following what he thinks is his right to do,
Okay.
which is kind of like following God. When you're doing what you think is right, hopefully you're trying to do good and good to God's will.
Well, hey, and if the Lord is with you, right, and you're doing what you think
Yeah.
is right, then we should think that, right,
Best
that'll
place
work
for her
out.
to go, yeah.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. And even though the Lord was with David, this wasn't. I mean, it probably would have happened either way, and that's where we are again at this weird kind of, balance between what happens is God's will, and on the other hand, like, we're not to be excused from our own actions. This doesn't mean that David isn't responsible for what he does, or Saul isn't responsible for what he does, or the others aren't, right? It's both is kind of true here, if that makes sense. It's not like David needed to not do nothing at all, and would have still gotten it all. There's David, there's still a. I hope you're getting. I hope I'm trying. I'm trying to get the point across. I guess that it's not like whatever David does, it's just.
Right.
He could have just kind of walked around there, like flicked the Philistines off, and 100 foreskins would have landed in his pocket. That's not what would have happened, right? It still took a little bit of, David still had to take action and still had to probably give it his best on the battlefield every single time. But it happened to work out, right? The Lord blessed his efforts, but it wasn't 100% God that just did it, It wasn't like a miracle that they all just kind of dropped dead at David's sight.
Right.
There was, both is true. God was with David, and God gave probably David the victory too, but it wasn't. David still had to act. David still had to be responsible.
He still had to fight. He still had to work.
He still had
for
to
it.
fight. Yeah, exactly. So the text is trying to say both. It's yeah. And the same is true for Saul too. He could have taken a better approach as well. But as the chapter goes on, right, we've kind of seen him grow increasingly. I think one of the last verses he even said, in verse 29, right? Saul was still more afraid, right? He was already scared in the very beginning, right? We saw it in verse 12 after he flung that spear. It was like, and Saul was afraid. And then David came back from the battlefield victoriously in verse 15. And Saul was in awe. And now he was even more afraid. I mean, he went from very afraid to even more afraid to maximum afraid, right? Scale,
So you ought to wake up and figure out God's really with Saul, and he better get with it.
That's right. Yeah. But instead, he decides to become David's enemy, which at the same time also means, right, he's kind of God's enemy, because he just figured out that the Lord is with David. So that's a problem. Yep. And while God is staying really close and tight with David, there's an increasing degree of separation here too, right, between God and Saul, right? If we think about it, even with that evil spirit coming down on him, and with him deciding to be David's enemy, who he knows is close to God. So this is an incredible success story for David, but it's a real tragedy actually for Saul if we think about it. And we didn't start out this Bible study, with Saul. It would have been worth it, but it would have been a lot. I think after this, I wanted to do 6 more sessions on David, but which is already long, I think, for a Bible study, at least of my caliber. I usually don't do them for like a half a year or so, just on one topic. But the thing is, I mean, if we looked at it, he was a young king. He was anointed by God. He was successful. We even have an episode where Saul is prophesying together with other prophets. So he was once very spiritually gifted in so many ways, right? And here we just kind of see him, crashing and burning, right? It's really kind of a sad thing to see too.
But to me, it's also is a reflection of a lot of our lives. Maybe we don't mess up as bad as he did.
Yeah.
Having an adulterous affair with your best friend and conceiving and then trying to commit murder to cover it up, and then going through all that and repenting and getting back into God's grace.
Yep.
He was given the gift. He fell from grace, but got back into grace.
Yeah.
And if he could be forgiven all that, maybe we can be forgiven of what the things we've done in our lives.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
And also, to me, that also means that we don't have to be perfect to serve God.
Very true. Yeah. And it kind of gives these stories also that's what makes them kind of interesting, right? There are people with faults here who will kind of fail.
Yeah, there's a lot of dirty laundry in here.
Yeah.
A lot of the heroes are having dirty laundry and faults and end up being villains, but repenting.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, good deal. We are actually at time here. This has been an hour pretty much. It's already 10 after 6. Any more comments, observations, questions, criticisms? Not so much. Okay. Well, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so are we going to start here for the next one, or are we?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, actually, what we're doing next week, I'm sorry, is 2 Samuel chapter 2.
All right.
2 Samuel 2. And I had a catchy name for it. and then, well, yes, let's see, what is 2 Samuel 2? Oh yeah, I think it's David becomes king. King of Judah and king of, yeah. That's going to be a spicy one too. David is going